a wonderful session. So, people, very good morning to all of you. And I'm glad that Dr. Sonali Patnaik has joined us today for this session. She's an independent researcher and currently associated with a couple of colleges as visiting faculty that include National Institute of Design and St. Xavier's College. She did BA Honours from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi, MA in English from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and MPhil from the Department of English, Delhi University. She was awarded Doctor of Philosophy in English by the Department of English, Mumbai University in 2018 for her thesis, Corporeal Chaos, The Politics of Masquerade in Contemporary Bollywood Cinema. She has published many research papers in the journals of national and international repute. She is also passionately involved in creative writing, and her poems and short stories are published in newspapers like Indian Express, literary magazines, and anthologies. Of late, her three poems, poetry, art, and artwork, published in an anthology titled The Kali Project, Invoking the Goddess Within, Indian Women's Voices by Indie Blue Publishing, Pennsylvania, US. If I am not wrong, her book with Routledge is already in progress. Her area of interest covers literature in English, philosophies of the body, gender studies and feminism, women's literature, literary theory, and film and literature. Welcome, Sonali, to the board. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Vaibhav, and thank you for giving me this wonderful opportunity. So I'm really looking forward to not just speaking, but also hearing from students and hoping to have a dialogic, session at the end. Let's see how that goes. Right. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. And it's a poetry book that is awaited. Let's see, and hopefully one on cinema. So, inshallah.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen, and I'm more of a talker. So I'm just going to. This is just what indicative of certain sections that I want to focus on. It's not really everything, because PowerPoints, honestly, to my mind, and Vaibhav knows this, is a synecdoche of everything that's going wrong with literary studies, really, because we are ultimately in the business of dialogic, argumentative kind of, and that's what ideally our research work ought to also reflect. So I'm just going to try and
Sure.
share this. So this says, okay. Vaibhav, just give me a second.
No problem. Please take it.
To this. So I see this share button, open share tray. Is this how it should work?
So you can open the PPT on your desktop, and from there you can upload it.
Okay, let me just minimize. The PPT is open, and okay.
Then you go back to the Teams.
Yes. Why doesn't it give me a sharing option?
It should give you, I think.
Is this it where it says open share tray? That's
yes.
But it doesn't give me the PPT, which is open. So just give me a second. I will need help.
No problem. Or you can simply mail me and I can do it on your behalf from here.
Okay.
If it doesn't work.
Okay. Just give me a second. I'm going to.
Sure.
So I'm not able to. Here. Open the Teams app. Yes, it's open. It's open here. Yes, it's open. But it's not giving me
the option.
Yes.
There.
Actually, yeah. Clicked on open share tray. This is all the options it's giving me. Where is the PDF is here. PPT.
You have to enable sharing, I think. That's one thing you have to do.
Vaibhav, is the sharing enabled? I think
here it is enabled by default.
By default, it's enabled.
Yeah.
It's not giving me that. Just It should give me this page. I don't know. Can
Um,
mail it to you then?
well, I will do it. Don't worry.
Okay.
Mail me quickly.
Okay.
Close share trait is here. Join conversation. So is your PDF open?
Right here, no?
Okay. It should show up over here, but it's not. Desktop. No. Okay, just mail it to him, I think. Mail him the PDF.
Have you already mailed, Sonali?
Yeah, I'll just mail it. I have to mail it. Just give me a second.
On my Gmail ID?
Yeah, I'll just mail it. I haven't mailed it. Just give me a second, Weber.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. I'll mail it on the same thread. Just a minute. Vaibhav Shah. Very sorry for the delay. I was sort of.
It's okay.
Yeah.
No problem.
I don't know why this is happening, but
It's okay.
okay. Okay, so I'm mailing you. I turned it into a PDF, and it's also okay. I'm mailing you the PowerPoint, Weber. If you can share it, that would be great. Yes.
You have mailed me on my PDPU ID, right?
Yes.
Just
It's just sending and sent. Yes.
Okay. So I'm yet to receive.
No problem. Can I just start addressing the students?
That's what I'm saying. You can start addressing. Meanwhile, I will do the needful.
So once the PPT will open, you will all see. Now, I'm aware that most of you already probably have your topics in hand, your doctoral students. You already know the area that you're going to look at and so on. So what I want to speak on, focus on today a little bit, which I do in my own area of research also, is the question of methodology. Because what I believe, and it's not just me, I think there are several critics of humanities scholars who believe that ultimately the method that we choose in order to find responses and discover, although discover is not a term that I'm particularly comfortable with when we speak about humanities and so on, and I'll tell you why. But ultimately, the methodology that we use, the tools that we use for our research are ultimately going to determine the kinds of consequences, ramifications, or discoveries that we make, meaning that we make in our research. So I think it's very, very critical. It is at the center of good research is the question of methodology, right? And it's also behoves us to think about the politics, at the heart of the methodological tools that we choose. So I know there are several ways in which we can think about research in the humanities, but I have whittled it down to three ways. And the first that I focus on is archival or genealogical studies, right? And we will focus a little bit on, of course, we all know of Foucault and what Foucault means with about genealogy and so on, and why genealogy, let's say, as opposed to history. That is something that I want to share, my sort of opinion and thoughts on, right? So archival work. Yes.
Can I start presenting now?
Yes, please do, please. But I will not have the controls, right, Weber?
You just give me a command and I will be.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. So I changed this title slightly, but it remains pretty much what we're looking at. I included the term, as you can see, new paradigms and challenges in research and English studies in the age of globalization. And I think this is important because we are living at a time, especially because of the internet.
Can everyone see the slide?
Is it visible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Please go.
Yes, sir, we can see.
Okay. Okay, so may I continue?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the reason I included the term globalization, I think, is important, not because it's, it's a fad and it's very important to, think about why it is important to me today, especially given that we are locked inside a lot of virtual spaces and so on, is that as many scholars and critics of globalization have pointed out, there is an influx of images, of people, of cultures that are now intersecting more rapidly, running across borders and boundaries and so on. There's that much more traveling, there is that much more spillage as far as people's cultures, communities, and so on are concerned. Our bodies are now, in a sense, products of this global influx of things, images, the traveling across, nomadic traveling across, in that sense, of several ideas, images, theories, bodies, and so on, right? So it's very, very important for us to, in a sense, position ourselves as scholars of research. So positionality becomes very important, to historicize ourselves, to position ourselves within this global influx of ideas and thought and epistemologies and so on, right? So, hence, I think the term is important for us to reckon with. I also think, and I will speak about this a little more into my talk also, it's important to speak about globalization from a decolonizing point of view. I mean, to begin with, as students of literature, I think one of the first questions, I remember my own professor back at the master's level used to ask, why English? Why literature, why language, and why English, or why literature or language in English, right? Clearly because of our colonial histories, because we were once colonized. But it's not just about history, it's not just about the past. The fact that, we were once colonized also continues into the way in which the world is arranged, into the way in which identities, labor, subjectivity, canons, everything is arranged today. So there are many trajectories, not a singular one, from the past, from colonial past to today's neo-colonial global presents and futures. So these are the trajectories that we really need to situate our research and ourselves in before we start to think about the areas of research that we're working in. So we can't speak from, in that sense, a historical vacuum. We must acknowledge our historical and discursive positions and locations in our work. So that's what I try to do in the title itself, right? Because paradigms, whose paradigms, from where, from what academia, all these are important. New, whose history, right? Whose chronology, whose time are we speaking about? Because new and old are again situated according to a certain politics of, chronology, a certain politics of temporality. So whose time? When we say modern, when we say new, who decided what pre-modern was and what modern was? So it's not my intend to be facetious at all. I think all of these things are extremely critical because they are questions of power and they are questions ultimately of discourse, and that is really what we're looking at, right? We are looking at discourse, and we're looking at adding to the discursive component of the world as research scholars, right? So if we can have the second slide, I will just explain the subtitles. Thank you so much. So as I was saying, these are the three distinct areas that I have sort of divided into. So first is archival or genealogical study. Then there is critical analysis, and that is philosophical, theoretical exegesis. I mean, that is really at the heart of most, I think, research that is done in the area of humanities by and large, and in the area of literature studies, definitely. The third, I picked on genre studies, and here I think I'm including something that may be more structural, right? It can be something other than genre studies also. You can look at poetry of a certain time period and so on. But what I'm indicating is a more structure-based analysis. So according to me, these are three critical ways in which one can think about doing research, right? Now, the first is of tremendous importance, and I want to pause a little bit on both terms, archive and genealogy, even though you might be familiar with the various sort of semantics and questions of power and history that are related to both these terms. I still think that it's very, very important that we think about them, right? So if I can have the third slide, I'll define, this is how I have defined archival or genealogical approach. Archival and genealogical work involves the construction of frames of study and the collecting, collating, and framing of documents, texts, literature that may not have seen the light of day or remain marginalized in previous research and archives. Okay. All of these terms actually that I have used bear thinking about when we are thinking about research in this fashion. One of the terms that are very helpful, although again problematic, to think about archival or genealogical approach to research is the word that Susie Tharu uses in a recent keynote address. She used the term housing. Okay, housing, that is putting something together within a particular framework so that we visualize that thing according to that lens, right? Frameworks appear as though paradigms. That's what we're talking about, right? That's really what paradigms are. Frames of study, frames of viewing, frames of approach, and so on. And frameworks often appear as though they are something that structure your research, but actually they are something else altogether. They are productive, right? When Foucault says discourse is productive, power is productive, paradigms are productive, right? They produce the kind of meaning and research and so on, that you are wanting to create. They are productive of, they constitute the very center as well as the backbone of your research, right? So the framework that you choose, and it's also not a very, it's not a question of, I'll just pick this or pick that, because historical location, your politics, all of that becomes very important when you're choosing a framework. That's why I said we need to historicize ourselves. So the term archive takes into this, into question this notion of history and historicizing the self and the work of research that you are doing. Now, one of the, a very, very good example of archival research or genealogical research, of course, there is Foucault's History of Sexuality, and I will focus on that also a little bit, is Tharu and Lalita, Susie Tharu and K. Lalita's own work, Women's Writing in English, and Women's Writing in India, I'm sorry. It's a 2-volume work. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. It's called Women Writing in India, Volume 1 and 2, Susie Tharu and K. Lalita. Volume 1 looks at poets from 600 CE to modern post-independence, 20th century India. And volume 2 looks at only 20th century women writers, right? So the very term itself, women writing in India, is a kind of framing, right? It is already suggesting to us, for instance, that the gender of the writer, and in this case women, is critical, is important to this work of research. Right? What it is doing is it's framing literature, it's framing writing from a gendered perspective. So it's producing writing as a gendered phenomenon. In the introduction, Tharu and Lalita say that they were asked when they were doing this critical research work several times, why do they feel that women's writing is separate? It deserves a separate kind of book or category or separate funding or separate attention than any other kind of writing. So they had to explain that, they had to elaborate upon that. And there are several reasons, obviously, that they give you as to why they choose to, focus on women's writing or women writing, right? And why that gendered, approach to writing is very, very critical. Because when we say writing, of course, and this they don't say, but it's obviously implied, when we say writing, we often assume that it's non-gendered writing. Right? But often that itself is a kind of paradigm, right? If you simply look at literary texts of a certain period and you don't, let's say, indicate what gender, what community is writing these literary texts, you are sort of, again, creating a kind of a paradigm that suggests that literature is outside of the question of gender or community or caste or class or whatever the question may be, right? So you are also framing literature in a certain way. But if you look at that literature and you interrogate that literature, as we do with canons, and that's what Tharu and Lalita are doing in their archival and genealogical research, if you interrogate those canons, you will realize that they are often very, very male canons, right? They're not only male canons, they could also be extremely privileged,
Sonali,
male
Sonali,
canons. Yes.
just a
Yes,
second.
yes.
Niyati, you want to say something?
Please.
Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to know our students that what Sonali is referring to, both the volumes that SLS library holds. So
Very
if
good.
any student wishes to refer to these two books, we do have it in our library.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Niyati.
Thank you, ma'am.
not
Thank
at
you,
all.
ma'am.
Wonderful. Yeah, these are honestly, these are the introduction work, as well as there are introductions to each section, that Tharu and Lalit have put together. To my mind, it's one of the most brilliant critical exegesis of feminist research work or post-colonial feminist research work. So yes, if the library has it, please do read, this introduction. And a lot of the things that I'm discussing, at least in the first half, will become clear, or I'm sure will become richer. Your understanding will become richer for it. So, to come back to this idea of housing, as Susie Tharu calls it. So, of course, there is a materiality, right? When we think about housing, and what she says is that's what frames do. So we must remember that while they house and they present literature or present textuality in a certain way, they're also producing that. So we have moved away from the idea, when we think about genealogy, we have moved away from the idea of representation alone, right? To the idea that what we represent or what we are looking at as representative is also constitutive. It creates that body of work in a certain way, right? So framing or a paradigm is also constitutive of a certain body of work. So they're constituting it in a particular way. And as they're doing it, they're also constituting, if you think about every term in that title, women, writing, India, all of this in a sense is getting mapped, right? So it's a framing that's mapping the nation, that is mapping the nation through writing, that is mapping writing itself, through the idea of the nation, as well as a gendered idea, that is mapping the idea of womanhood through the question of textuality, authorship, writing, and so on, and the relationship between women's identity, subjectivity, to not just literature and writing, but to also the nation. So all of these things, in a sense, because of the framing, the paradigm chosen, getting mapped or remapped in that sense, or reformulated. And if you read that introduction, they talk about the various ways in which such a configuration reconfigures predetermined ideas about the nation, about women, about women's relationship with literature, with English studies, and so on, right? So beautiful, beautiful, complex work. And I just want to hint at a few things from there, so we think about the idea of archive and genealogy, right? So if we can have the next slide, please, Vaibhav, slide number 4. Yeah. So I'll just read this out to you, and then I'll explain what I actually mean. So these are some of the examples that I have of genealogical and archival research. So what the definition of genealogical research, which we have been looking at, limitations of such a research, and significant new directions of thought. So Tharuk and Lalita's 2-volume work, which I've already introduced to you, it's feminist, post-colonial, interventionist, and I will explain what I mean by that, archival work. That is a fine example of work that thinks through the politics of archiving, its intent and its consequences, from a deeply intensive and exhaustive theoretical and critical engagement with feminist, post-colonial theory, both global and local. And in their introduction, they define the scope of their work, something all of you must be struggling with or will at some point, because we have to remember, as I did with my own PhD writing, my guide would often remind me that the PhD research is not everything. It's like a stepping stone to further research, right? So I use this work, Tharu and Lalita's, as an example. Obviously, it's not a PhD work, but it's a research work, a research that fits into the idea of genealogical and archival research. But they too had to define the scope of their work, and they too have to talk about the fact that they're limited by their own, location. So how much access they have to other languages, to scholars who have done work in other languages, who can then, dig out works that they can include, their own, let's say, political, ideological sort of or theoretical leanings, which will then allow them to choose certain works or select certain works. Thank you, Vaibhav. Select certain works and not include others. So all of these politics of choice, as it were, are part of housing or framing a product as housing as. I like that term, as I said, but there's a certain materiality which I feel needs to be contested and challenged. When we say housing, we think about it as a material truth, but as we know, all materiality is also a discursive formulation. So, of course, Tharu and Lalita are very aware of this, right? So, the immense significance of this research is in the intensive exegesis of theoretical frameworks, and through that, the construction of their own framework within which to place and read the works, which makes it, to my mind, an absolutely critical work of archival research. For this, Tharu and Lalita, the editors define their methodology, intent, and theoretical and ideological positioning for all the choices also determine the way in which these texts are reproduced and disseminated. So they argue in this introduction, and they do this by focusing and foregrounding Euro-American feminist research primarily, and they're looking mostly at, because this is written in the end of the 1990s, early 2000 is the area of theoretical research they're looking at. They speak back, as it were, from their historical locations as erstwhile colonies and as post-colonial feminists to the second wave of Euro-American feminism, right? So they're speaking back to the gynocritics, they're speaking back to people like Elaine Showalter, to Kate Millett, to Gilbert and Gobar, Susan Gilbert and Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gobar, yeah, Mad Woman in the Attic and so on. You might be familiar with many of these texts. Now, so they are positioning their research work also within this theoretical framework, right? So whether it is a mimetic framework or in this case, as I say, interventionist or interruptive, that is a choice the scholar has to make, right? So what they do is they acknowledge that they're borrowing some of the paradigms that are set into motion by second wave feminism, especially that of archiving women's writing so that these voices, as it were, are not lost to the void or in the void, because literature, by and large, at least this is Elaine Showalter's argument, has been mostly a male-dominated territory. Showalter's argument, of course, many of you would be familiar with. What she's saying is that most of the representation of women in, male literary texts is limited to men's experience or understanding of women, and that could be patriarchal, heteronormative, whatever. She doesn't use the term heteronormative, but that's what's indicated. So it's very important for us to archive women's own voices, in the way in which they represent themselves. And that, according to Showalter, brings in a certain authenticity of women's experience. Now, whether we argue, agree on this or not is a separate matter altogether, and hopefully we will have time to focus on that a little bit later. Now, what Tharu and Lalita argue is that while this is very, very critical and important, and somewhere they, share that need to put together, archive and put together women's voices, writing voices across time in India. They also feel that there are a lot of essentialist, universalist, and colonial politics embedded in second wave feminist writing, right? And one of them is, for instance, this idea of Showalter and Gilbert and Gubar and others talk about in terms of writing as though all women's writing is a release from patriarchal oppressive forces. So what Tharu and Lalita quite rightly point out is that that is limited to their understanding, right? These women's understanding, which is primarily a Euro-American one and a 19th century one. So it's located, again, historicized, located within a particular time period, as well as within a certain class identity and within a certain theoretical paradigm, which needs to be challenged. Even as you sort of borrow or are inspired by that theoretical paradigm, you also need to interrupt it or contest it or challenge it. And they do that by pointing out the universalist, essentialist, as I said, assumptions made by Showalter and by Gilbert and Gubar. Now, what both of these critics are arguing is that, as I said, that they talk about women's authentic voices, and that writing is, ultimately, comes from experience and so on. What Tharu and Lalita point out is that experience itself is a very limited aesthetic category, right? And it's related to 19th century realism. And as we know, realism in itself is also, as an aesthetic category, many of you will be very familiar with these arguments, is also embedded in other politics. And some of those politics are politics of industrialization, colonization, empire, class, and so on. Realism is a very limited, class limited in that sense, way of seeing the world or writing about the world. In Europe itself, it was contested in the second half of the 20th century and so on. What it, of course, meant for the empire is a whole different story, right? So they argue that the foregrounding by Euro-American feminism, particularly during the second wave, of a singular monolithic notion of women's writing based on their limited engagement with women's experience, primarily relegated to the 19th century upper middle class woman's experience of releasing herself from patriarchal oppression and foisting it upon the world as central to all female literary traditions, is obviously deeply problematic. It is, among other things, a question of power. Experience itself, a phenomenological category, often embedded in European bourgeois realism and Enlightenment-led discourses such as positivism, and its relationship, as I just outlined, with industrialization, colonialism, and capitalism, goes unexplored when it is uncritically universalized as the only paradigm via which to read women's literature or authorship, right? The subject that such a research produces is mimetic of the white middle-class woman, and feminist archival research gets defined by a few privileged women, thus leaving their role in invisibilizing identities and histories of other women, such as Black, Brown, queer, Dalit, and other marginalized women, completely uninterrogated. It also obfuscates the way in which theoretical frameworks and methodologies reproduce and reinforce colonial capitalist power through academic discourse, right? Thus, Tharu and Lalita's exhaustive theoretical analysis foreground for us these critical aspects of research into literature, language, and humanities in general. Given the history of English studies, this is also something many of you would be very, very familiar with, thanks to the work of Gauri Vishwanathan and Edward Said and so on, that English studies itself was a tool, as it were, to spread and consolidate the power of the British Empire upon India, right? So we must, in that sense, always be alert to our own positions, privileged as well as historical, as scholars of English literature and English studies, language studies as well, which was one of the critical tools and one of the most powerful tools that the British used in India in order to consolidate their hold. And what is the relationship of that past to the present, where English still remains, in a sense, the lingua franca of a globalized, neoliberal capitalist world? What is the relationship of that, and what is our location within that particular trajectory is something that we really need to focus on when thinking about research. So to come back to this, given the history of English studies as a means of consolidating the empire, and today the language persisting as lingua franca of a global world, how may we resist the co-option of marginal voices and epistemologies into a dominant narrative of a meta-archive, right? One of the meta-archives that comes to mind immediately, I hadn't thought of this when I was writing this, but just when I'm speaking to you, I can think of something like Wikipedia is a kind of meta archive, right? And it appears as an extremely transparent, translucent body of archival work that puts together, information everywhere. But thanks to Foucault, thanks to Said, thanks to the work of Vishwanathan and so many others, we know that there is no innocent, disinterested discourse or information, right? That's what I'm trying to talk about or alert us to here also. So what is the politics in that sense of a Wikipedia-like approach to research, right? Who writes it? What is, what is the framework or what are the paradigms used for such kind of archival research work? One of the things that we often hear from those working within that kind of a paradigm is this idea that there needs to be a more archiving or excavating of lost voices. So I want to come to this idea of the notion of loss and why this is problematic when we think about genealogical or archival research, because immediately the question that comes to mind is loss to whom, right? So who was the viewer of this research work, or who is the consumer of this information, and then hence who is it lost to and who made it lost? Because let's not forget, ultimately, again, loss itself is a kind of paradigm, isn't it? Loss, the idea of loss produces something as worthy of mourning, but it also produces something as agency-less or without any politics, right? It produces something in a void, as though the object of literature got lost. But of course, we know that the process of loss is a historical process. And it's a political process, right? Just like with the women's voices that Tharu and Lalita are foregrounding, highlighting, archiving, when we are doing our research, we need to be very, very alert to when we say we are excavating that lost voices, whether they're marginalized voices or voices. We need to be very, very alert to what the politics of that loss is, because we are then signing up to or agreeing to having created an a priori false notion of primacy, that something was whole or total to begin with, and in some magical way, not a historical or political way, not with any agency, not with the phallic power of the pen or anything, magically or tragically simply got lost. And as diligent scholars of English studies or anthropological studies, we are now collecting back those lost objects. That in itself is a deeply problematic framing, right, that we must be very, very aware of. So I will read a little bit. Vaibhav, if you could please move to the next slide. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry you're having to do this. Right. So I will speak a little bit about this whole business of loss and inclusion, which again Tharu and Lalita speak about in their introduction. I'm really just sitting on their shoulders, as it were, and these are giant figures when it comes to thinking about, I think, archival and genealogical research, especially from a post-colonial perspective, right? So we must reckon with some of these figures very much when we do our research. So if we can't think of archives in terms of loss or inclusion, and I'll come to that also, it's related, then how can we define archival work or genealogical work? So resistance to loss and inclusion in archival research, and the move towards anti-foundationalism and non-essentialism, right? So Tharu and Lalita contest that Anglo-American feminism's construction of feminine subjectivity through writing, the very definition of women's writing, by demonstrating the colonial, racial, and empirical and positivist politics of that definition and archival work, right? Positivist also in this sense, I know, I'm sure many of you again know that this term I borrow from post-enlightenment notions of empirical science, phenomenology, science, and so on. Positivist meaning that all discourse is singular, monolithic, and in a sense, it's all tapered towards a single goal, right? So it's teleological in that sense. Now we need to rethink this teleological approach to research. That's what Tharu and Lalita are arguing, and that's what I'm also trying to argue, because who maps that line, right? When we say teleology, we mean goal-oriented, right? So who maps that particular line of history? Who has agency there, or who is that subject of history who gets to stand outside of history and map and chart the territory for us in this way, where many of us in developing worlds in the global south fall short of having arrived at the full place of research in, let's say, women's writing. Right? This, of course, as you can see, as I have pointed out, is extremely problematic because it is nothing but a continuation of colonial politics, right? Where the power remains with, again, Western academia and so on, forces of Western academia. And because of the way the world is arranged and academics is arranged, it travels down, trickles down to us. And we are supposed to not just mime it, but plot ourselves as further back in that trajectory, moving towards that one universalist goal that has been defined for us. In this case, as Showalter and Gilbert and Goubart define as women's authentic experience and voices and so on, by putting their writing out there so that they too may be included in the totality that is envisioned as literature, right? But what we need to be asking is, as I pointed out earlier, is how did such a totality get created that then marginalized or put at loss women's writing? Because if women were always writing, because that is what this research work has found, and I'm sure many of you will find such critical interventions into marginalized writing or language studies, whatever that may be, or anthropological approaches to object studies and so on. If these objects, images, writing already existed, if women already wrote, how is it that we are now sitting and accepting this construction of a totality of literature that always existed where women's writing was not included? And now we must find and include it, right? So this framework itself is extremely problematic, because as they will show, Tharu and Lalita, with the example of various texts, especially in India, for instance, this Euro-American understanding of loss and inclusion does not sit well with various other, let's say, histories and epistemologies, right? One of the examples that they give us, and I'll just read through this and I'll give you the example that they speak about. So they critique the ideas of loss and inclusion often taken as fundamental to archival research by foregrounding the foundationalist and essentialist biases of such a framework, especially for the study of gender, history, and literature. What do I mean? I'll pause a little bit and speak about foundationalism and essentialism, since I'm using the term so much. And please bear with me, those of you who might be familiar with it already, right? So what I mean is that when we say that there is already a body of work that can be taken for granted called literature, and that some work has somehow been lost to this totality and we must retrieve it, we are looking at a very foundationalist construct of the idea of literature. This is a myth, okay? And we need to demystify it, because as we know that loss was actually an act of erasure, right? If women were always writing, what is it, as Virginia Woolf asks, for instance, in a Room of One's Own, what is it that has stopped us from, or history from documenting this work? Why is it simply not there? Why is it that when I go to the library, she says, I don't find enough works by women, and I only find women in the works of men? But those women look nothing like the real women that I meet. So what is going on? What is going on here is that literature has been constructed in such a way. It purportedly is transcendental. It purportedly is non-gender, non-class, and outside of history and so on. But it is very much historical. It is very much gendered and so on. And women's literature has been left in that sense, as many other marginalized forms of literature, to the margins. It has been violently erased for very, very many reasons. And one of them, as Woolf talks about, I'm talking about Virginia Woolf now, is social and political conditions, economic conditions, where even if women were writing, as she points out so beautifully in her quasi-fictional, quasi-historical fact into, interwoven with fiction kind of work, even if women wrote, at least she says this of England at that time, or from Shakespeare's age onwards, they would probably have not had the chance to either publish. If they went to a publisher, then their material would probably not be seen as worthy of literature. Even if it was, they would probably not be paid enough for it. Without money, they would have, and other sources of employment and so on, they would have probably had to, some would end up marrying, having children. So what she points out then is that larger, several trajectories of history that intersect to erase women's writing, the possibility of women's writing, the content of women's writing, because the aesthetics then are determined by patriarchy, so then women's writing does not measure up to that particular standard, right, which is obviously determined not by women themselves, and then the economics of it and so on, as well as the sociopolitics of it, right, which would lead them to be either ridiculed or penniless or whatever. So many trajectories, right? So to call it a loss, like I said, becomes nothing but a parody of the idea of the way in which discourses work. Discourses, knowledge, forms of knowledge are always interest driven, right? That's a term I borrow from Gayatri Spivak, the idea that it's, there is always interest, there is no knowledge that is innocent, as she says, right? It's always interest driven, right? So no research that is innocent either in that sense, no discourse that is innocent, right? And from Foucault, we know this simple and very, very important idea that all knowledge production is to do with the questions of power. And that is really what Tharo and Lalita and Wolf and all of these writers are doing. They're pointing out how research ultimately and archival and genealogical work is to do with power. So what are the trajectories of power that have rendered or produced writing or research in a particular way? So notions of loss and exclusion, for instance, lost women writers, lost classics, exclusions from the canon, are always underwritten. This is directly a quote from the text, always underwritten by a dream of wholeness or completeness. A lost or excluded object can be recognized when it is found and restored to the place from which it was missed. Do you see the brilliance of this writing? What they're saying is several things. One is, whose dream is this particular wholeness or completeness? That is always, again, a question of power, right? Those within certain echelons of the academia, depending whether it's the West, depending on how the world is organized in that sense, how labor is organized, it is the powerful's dream in that sense of a wholeness or a completeness, right? And not just that, not only is it their fantasy, right, as Showalter and Gilbert and Gubar have a fantasy for the rest of the world and the rest of the women of the world, right? They're speaking for everyone that their work has participated. So many of them, I should say, not everyone, whose their work has participated in disrecognizing. Now they have a fantasy that they want to foist upon, universalize and foist upon these others, right? So you see the irony of this kind of work. So the lost or excluded object can be recognized. Now we come to the whole question of cognition, right? Again, a very, very critical aspect of humanities research. What are the terms, the epistemologies that we are using that makes, right? What discourses are we using or deploying that makes our object of scrutiny recognizable? Now, just to pause and give a separate kind of example, if, let's say, most of the canon has been defined in a Brahmanical way, the literary canon, right? It obviously goes without saying that it would have been defined according to, Brahmanical discourses of power, Brahmanical aesthetics, that which, quite banally putting it, a certain community of people would have determined as high literature. Right? So this is an act of power, right? This is an act of power which presents itself as transcendental totality and so on, right? In doing so, in creating an aesthetic category that is primarily reflecting their own glory back to them, they would also exclude, let's say, Dalit writing, right? I remember, I'm not mentioning speakers or writers, and that's not important also. A certain speaker once saying at a forum, the problem with Dalit writing is that it is bad writing. Okay. Of course, I was deeply offended and shocked by this idea, but I had to think about it further, and it relates to what we're speaking about here, hence I am bringing it, right? So this is bad writing according to whom? According to the criteria and parameters and paradigms in aesthetic theory that have been set by a Brahmanical force, right? A upper caste men and upper caste privileged communities, right? So, of course, by those standards and by that category, it is going to be bad writing, right? Not only bad writing, it is also unrecognizable. It's not just a lost object. The object was made lost. It was erased, right? There is an epistemic violence taking place here. I'm quoting Spivak, of course. The phrase is not mine. Again, many of you would be familiar. There is an epistemic violence that the upper caste community would have, in that sense, uh, generated or created upon those whose work cannot be recognized as good work because they occupy a different epistemology, way of looking at the world altogether, right? A different aesthetics altogether. So you, by saying it is bad writing, you are actually saying that it's unrecognizable to us, that our epistemic framework, which we have because of power made a universalist framework, does not or cannot recognize the other. Okay, this is a very powerful idea in gender studies also. The inability to recognize the transgender, the inability to recognize the queer body or queer identity and so on is nothing but, again, an epistemic violence, right? Where the discourses that we use, the epistemologies that we use may be already embedded with aesthetic choices and politics and so on that are aligned with certain forces of power, whether they're racial, gendered, class, capitalist, empire, etc., etc., etc. So what they do in their work is they reclaim the territory of feminist genealogical archival work from an Anglo-American and Eurocentric point of view, and they seek to interrupt the flow, right? So interruption, to my mind, is an extremely important word, right? When we are thinking about research, disruptive or interruptive. Transnational feminism uses the term disruption a lot. We know from post-structuralism that there is a term deconstruction that you would be very, very familiar with, and then interruption, which I find personally very, very helpful, because it's not that you're completely disrupting something, because let's admit it, we are in the flow of receiving certain, Euro-American theory within which we are to place our own objects of scrutiny. But of course, that is going to create an imbalance, right? And to my mind, that frisson, that imbalance is the heart of your research. That is where you interrupt the flows of power and the intersections between discourse or knowledge and power, right? In whatever field that you are working on, right? So how do we think then about, as I said, genealogical work that is non-foundationalist and so on? I want to give you an example of, the work of a researcher who I particularly, of a critic, scholar, philosopher, are deeply indebted to, and that is queer philosopher, feminist Judith Butler. I'm sure many of you would be very, very familiar with Butler's work, but I don't want to speak in a vacuum, so it's very important for me to just cite not just sources, but whose literally shoulders I'm standing on and talking here. It's very, very important to do that, right? So Butler's work is this, and there are many, many scholars, for instance, that I can name, Zizek and Spivak and so many others, who are doing this kind of anti-foundational. It's a subaltern historian group, for instance, and we'll come to that as well. Right. So what does Butler say when she's speaking about foundationalism? And it's very, very helpful. So what Judith Butler points out to us through her reading of the human body, right, is that the body, which is usually seen as an inviolable ontological truth, right? The body is simply there. That's what most people believe, right? It's simply there. We can only read it or we can see it, but it makes itself so visible. It is so material that it must somewhere stand outside of discourse, right? It must stand outside of genealogy. But we know from Foucault that sexuality itself has a genealogy, right? Sexuality itself has a history, at least as far as Europe is concerned. That's what Foucault's history of sexuality is all about. That it's not a thing outside of discourse. That it is a product of a certain discursive or several discursive trajectories and the way they have been flowing down to us, right? So similarly, when we come to the body, now Judith Butler, to my mind, is one of the first people who has done it. What are the genealogies of the body? Of course, when she's writing, if you have read the preface to Gender Trouble, for instance, she points out when she was doing this research work, and since we are research scholars, I think this is a good anecdote. When she was researching on the body, she says that several of her colleagues would tell her, but Judy, it's the body. It's there for everyone to see, right? It's just the body. What can you research on it? I mean, you can't really contest it. You can't really see it as a product of discourse and so on, right? It's there. Now, what Butler points out is the term Judy itself is used to indicate that there are some things that remain outside the work of research, right? Which is something that she obviously contests, because everything is mediated through language in that sense, right? Everything is mediated through language and research. So how is the body something that remains outside in that sense of research? So she says that call Judy is supposed to indicate to me that some things cannot be discursively produced or researched. And secondly, it is to remind me of the material ontological truth, the inviolable, unshakable truth about the body. But as Judith Butler's work will show us, the body is nothing but a product of discourse, and it has several genealogies in that sense, right? One of them, what she looks at, is how the materiality of the body is constituted, right? So she gives us the example, for instance, of a speech act. Okay, this is something she borrows from Austin's speech act theory, right? So many of you would be so familiar with this, right? The language is performative, that it is not just descriptive. Language does not simply describe that which is there. So this dichotomous idea that the body exists and language simply describes it is extremely problematic. What she says is that when a child is born and the nurse puts her out there and declares it's a girl or it's a boy, you are already performatively producing according to a heteronormative logic the body of the child. You don't say it's a child, right? Even that is a kind of production in that sense. Even that's a performative production, but you are not only just performatively producing the body, you are producing it according to a heteronormative binary politics of boy and girl, right? So it starts right there. So there is no such thing as a material body that simply can be read. So when we come to then queer bodies, she says it's no surprise that when we have discursively produced bodies right from the beginning according to heteronormativity, it is no surprise that we cannot recognize, just like Dalit literature cannot be recognized as good literature by epistemic frameworks that might have excluded them, epistemic frameworks about the body would have excluded queer bodies in such a way that makes it unrecognizable altogether. Another powerful example, in fact, Judith Butler gives several, and she tackles all the Western philosophers and the way in which they materialize a truth about the body, right, and produce this materiality. And so we cannot take the body's essentialism for granted. So the point I'm trying to make is that we need to think in our research outside our in contestation of ideas of essentialism. If the body itself, which is seen as so essential, itself can be seen as a product of research and discursive trajectories, then of course everything has, all objects have. I know there are scholars who will not agree, saying objects have a life outside of discourse, but I'm not convinced. Because in order to see or study any object, we must reckon with its history. We must reckon with language. And language is already a mediation. Language is already embedded in histories, in society, in politics, and so on and so forth, right? So if, Vaibhav, I'm sorry, if we could have the next slide, please. I'll just quickly conclude about what I was saying about foundationalism and Butler. Again, the other example she gives, which I think is powerful, is the Oedipal complex. Okay, so she says, for instance, this is an example of foundationalist thinking or discourse or research, because Freud has, and Lacan also takes it for granted, and Kristeva also takes it. So many take this foundational myth for granted, that there is a mother and father of a child. Today, we will find this very laughable, given the amount of rainbow families that we see, and two mothers and fathers and so on. But I think when Freud was writing, it was probably a lot more naturalized than it is today, right? Thankfully, we've moved forward from there. So there's a mother and father, and Freud, of course, says that the boy child, when the boy child is born, is one with the mother, and sees the father's presence as a kind of fear, a threatening presence, right? And his identity is defined once the father enacts or performs himself as this position of authority, saying, no, your mother belongs to me, and you better go find your own person, as it were, right? We can already see, I'm laughing because we can already see how deeply heteronormative this idea is, right? There are so many heteronormative assumptions here. One is that why just the boy child should see the father as a point of threat. So what Butler goes on to say is that if this is true of the boy child, then it should be true of the girl child as well, right? She too should be seen as one with the mother. How does Freud then make the leap from there to say that the girl child does not perceive the father as a position of threat, as a figure of threat, but rather sees the mother as a figure of threat? So this leap, that discursive leap that Freud makes, this slippage, to use Derrida's term, is nothing but evincing of his heteronormative, ideology or politics, right? So the drama, or as it were, of origins is already a heteronormative one. So much for foundationalist myths. All foundationalist myths always carry some form of ideology or politics. In this case, a very heteronormative one, right? So what Butler then helps us to think about, those of you who are doing research in, let's say, Western feminism, or using that theoretical paradigm, I find Butler's work is so critical, because it challenges a lot of the things that are taken for granted by writers like Kristeva, Irigaray, Sixu, and so many others, and other American feminists as well, where they take this point of origin without question. They take the body as an essentialist idea without questioning it, right? So today, and my work is also a lot of this, when I look at Bollywood cinema and popular other visual cultures and so on, I look at the way in which the body is produced through visual discourses, right? The body does not simply exist somewhere in the vacuum. We, in a sense, discourses generate bodies. So if you are looking at working on visual cultures, one of the helpful things to think about is how visual cultures generate certain kinds of tropes or myths about the human body. Of course, Bollywood cinema, in fact, popular cinema, or not just Bollywood, other forms of cinema. I know little about Tamil and the South cinema. But whatever little I know, there are certain repetitive tropes, for instance, that both cinematic texts and literary texts produce about the body. What this does is it constitutes, in that sense, the body in a particular way. So your research, if you're researching around something like the body, genealogical research can actually unpack not just the histories of bodies, but the genealogies of bodies. That is the discursive production of bodies in that sense, right? Now, the second part of, so the three aspects I have divided, I'll just read this. How do we move, as I said, from anti-foundationalist, from a foundationalist approach to research to an anti-foundationalist or non-essentialist one? Foucault is the other example. So I'll come to that. Just read this here. anti-foundationalist or historically conscious paradigms of research. How then can we think about archival work without replicating and naturalizing ideas of loss, inclusion, exclusion, essentialisms about the body, about objects, and so on, and without ignoring the way in which our locations and the context of production of texts and archives are indeed constitutive of their meaning and recognizability? Right? We begin with thinking through methodology. And this is where I come back to where I started. Methodology is critical. The tools we use produce the work, in a sense, right? The tools we use to write or research with, in a sense, create paths and other paradigms and channels via which our research is going to go forth, right? So it's very, very important to think about tools or the location of tools in that sense that we're using. So just to quickly then outline Foucault's, obviously I've already talked about Foucault's concept of genealogy. It is different from history, at least that is what I understand, and that's important to remember, right? Because a history, or at least traditional notions of history, of objects, of texts or canons, whatever they may be, assume that things exist and we can just go and pick up these scattered objects and bring them back and arrange them in a particular order, right? What Foucault is saying through genealogy is that no, it is not possible for us to reach back. Whenever we are reaching back, we are also, in a sense, constituting those objects through a particular lens, right? So the difference is that discourses are constitutive of, productive of the very thing that they seek to describe or explain. Right, this is the critical difference. Whereas traditional history writing would think of objects of historical research already existing and history as a means of recovering those objects. But Foucault would argue that recovery itself is a kind of paradigm, is a kind of framework that produces objects, as we saw in the first half, through a particular lens, and that politics obviously needs to be interrogated. So all truth in that sense is in intersection with questions of power. And that is what we need to interrogate, analyze, and so on. So this is one of the ways in which we can think about doing research from a non-foundationalist point of view or non-essentialist point of view. The dangers of essentialism are, of course, many, because they're always from the point of view of a particular community, class, people, or culture. Right? And essentialist myths, basically what they do is that they replicate one particular, culture's worldview, epistemology, what have you, ontology, as true of all other cultures and so on. So today it is extremely important as researchers from the global south for us to reckon with not just interrupting essentialisms and foundationalisms where we find them, especially when they come from positions of power to us, right, by locating ourselves within our histories and so on, and by interrogating the myths that are embedded in them, but also by channeling our research towards multiplicity, right? So some of the most exciting, I think, research work is coming from, I can think of several scholars, including Butler, Zizek, Slavoj Zizek, whose work on cinema, anthropology, Arjuna Padurai, Aniket Javare, even someone like G.N. Devi, much closer home. I think, a lot of that exciting work is coming from those people who are able to challenge these, power-laden epistemologies and look for multiplicity, other ways and other epistemologies, or several ways of thinking about the same thing, right? So in that sense, the thing does not any longer remain the same. We say the same thing, but it does not any longer remain the same, right? Okay, so three aspects, I have broken it down. Of course, there are several to genealogical research. One is, the productive role of language, as well as, of course, the productive role of power. That is the second one, which I have spent a lot of time on. And I can explain further, if you would like, what I mean by productive role of power, because this is a Foucauldian idea, and Butler also uses this, which is that power is, according to Foucault, again, many of you would be aware of this, power does not exist outside of subjectivity, right? All our identities and subjectivities are fractalizations of power. So whether it is a question of caste or class or capitalism, global channels of labor and so on, and labor control, all of these are somehow fractalized within our notions of self, right? Our own identities in that sense are already fractalized with questions of power. They already exist as assemblages of power, right? So earlier notions like Gramsci's to a certain extent, but even other thinkers, power was often, even Lyotard and several others, your Frankfurt School of Thinkers, power was often thought of as outside of subjectivity, identity, and so on, right? So you have governmental power, institutional power, and so on. I think what is very critical in Foucault's work, and then Said, for us, always Said and Spivak and so on, because we are of the global south, and we do need to think about, and of course, many more local thinkers, which I'm sorry to say I don't know enough of, but I will, demarcate whenever I can remember them. The important shift in that sense of thinking about power is to not think about it as something that exists only in institutions, but rather our own identities, texts, canons, objects as already infused with questions of power. So one area of genealogical research is to interrogate and dissect and deconstruct the way in which power is already interlaced with both the representation and the reproduction of certain identities or subjectivities. Whatever your area of research might be, questions of power can be interrogated there, right? So this is very different from saying that if we unpack the politics of the representation of something, we have understood something about how things are represented in cinema or poetry of a certain area. It's very different, because what it's saying is that our identities are interlaced with the way in which cinema produces identity. So let's say we are thinking about gendered identity. So the way in which popular cinema produces gender identity is also something that inflects our subjectivity, right? So power is not outside, but already embedded. So analyzing it is two-pronged, because it would mean analyzing the way in which I might self-censor or I might be limited by my own historical locations, right? And that is very, very critical when we are doing research on around marginal communities, right? So let's say we are, like G. N. Devi's work, which is so commendable, and I think there needs to be so much more work in this area. For instance, researching on tribal writing, right? Tribal languages, which are fast depleting, right? The tribal communities being one of the original communities in that sense of India and other parts of South Asia, but now we have come to a point where they are museumized as other, right? So this is how dangerous discourses can be. So even as you run to save, tribal communities, you are also replicating certain discourses or paradigms via which to regard them or see them, right? I remember a short anecdote meeting Devi once, and it really stayed with me what he said. And he had come accompanied with a tribal artist, and he said that he was invited to this seminar, but I didn't wish to, sit here and put a tribal person on display so that the rest of us in academia could feel very happy about ourselves, thinking that we have included, remember this idea of inclusion, included, marginal forces and so on, and our consciences could be at rest. But at the same time, he said, I am not someone to speak for him. So I had to extend your invitation to him. And of course, he has to make his decision, just like I had to make my decision about coming or going. And he chose to come. And herein, I think Devi also lays out his own limitations as an academic from above, and what he might end up doing in his, important and necessary work in archiving tribal literature, translating, archiving, disseminating, publishing and disseminating tribal literature. In that necessary work, he might also end up co-opting certain forces and voices that are not for him to co-opt. This is something that we see very often in research done by African-American feminists, for instance. Black critics, Black scholars, women scholars often talk about being, warning Black writers and scholars of having their voices co-opted by white women or white scholars and so on. And it's not a very individualistic thing. It's not that this particular person is co-opting my voice. I think what they're also talking about is precisely what Gayatri Spivak means when she says epistemic violence. They're talking about, again, their voices or ways of thinking or doing being subsumed into larger epistemologies which are constructed by the West, right? Or by a certain white subjectivity or identity, right? So when we say globalization, and that is why I also indicated this right in the beginning of my presentation, the title, the term is not something that you can, easily take home and sit comfortably with. You must reckon with it in your research. When we call ourselves researchers from the global south, you need to, in your writing, in your thesis, in your research, obviously outline, right, and determine what it means to be a person occupying the global south, what privileges that means, and what limitations that generates, as it were. So this is what Spivak says: we cannot not think about the other, right? We must speak for can the subaltern speak, right? Critical essay. What is the takeaway? To me, the takeaway is this: of course, you must speak and identify where the subaltern is being erased or being rendered voiceless. But you have a responsibility that goes along with it, where you mark your own limitations when it comes to speaking for someone. Right? When you're archiving or critically analyzing, marginal work that belongs to marginal communities and so on, if whether you belong to that community or not, of course, that will also change how you write about it. But if you do not belong to the community, it's extremely important that you identify the limits of your own voice and be critical of and alert to the power that you might have to co-opt certain epistemologies, certain voices onto your own existing frameworks or paradigms and so on. So the other way of looking at it, then, the helpful way is to bring it to, again, I'm using a term from Gayatri Spivak, to bring it to a productive crisis, right? So normally we think about crisis as a problem, but this I find very, very helpful when we think about our positions as scholars from a global south who should ideally always be conscious of history, historical location, or genealogy, if you want to call it, and of decolonizing and the project of decolonizing, right? And so in being alert to your decolonizing impulse or project or whatever, I think one of the best ways in which you can do this is because you sit in a way at the borders of theory, borders of thought between, and now the West and the East also no longer as terms suffice, thankfully. That binary does not exist, but there are borders, and very manned borders, both physical and intellectual, right? So you must think about crossing those borders, discursive borders, all the time. But even as you cross, you have to remember your limitations or mark the limitations of discourse, right? As well as bring several theoretical points of view to a productive crisis. This, I think, is terribly helpful in creating new territory, right? In rejecting or discarding older paradigms that do not work for us. I will give you an example from the work of, let's say, Lalita Gopalan. Okay, she's someone who comes to mind, someone who's my own research has depended on also quite a bit, other than Judith Butler. Lalita Gopalan, in her introduction to Cinema of Interruptions, which is where I also use the term interruption, I borrow from there, outlines that when she was a research scholar and she was teaching, because as a research scholar in America, you also have to take on some teaching assistantship. So she says when she was teaching, she would often hear these very disparaging comments about Indian cinema as being mimetic, right, as being derivative, right? So most people would think of it either as completely unrecognizable. So we're coming back to the same two ideas, right? How epistemological paradigms and frameworks render something unrecognizable, or render them, and we're talking about co-option and so on, render them as derivative of. Right? We go back to Butler. This is exactly what she's saying. If the paradigm, if the foundational paradigm is already a heteronormative one, the only way in which you can think about queer bodies is as a derivative other of the binary of male, female, or simply unrecognizable. So hence abnormal, right? Which is what we think about, queer subjectivities. When I say we, obviously I'm being extremely conscious of the term. That is, heteronormative paradigms think about or cannot think about when they think about queer identity. So it's all coming down to those same ideas, right? So the problem then with this whole way of thinking about Bollywood cinema, which is something I tackle in my own research as derivative, of course, is again a neo-colonial capitalist problem. It again goes down to the way in which the international division of labor, of neoliberalism, the way the market is formed, because the market is swamped and swallowed and controlled by Hollywood, and Hollywood presents itself as the central popular culture, and then the centrifugal force is supposed to send out these, lines of trajectories that supposedly then mime and influence local cultures. This construct itself, the centrifugal one, is so problematic, right? It is seeped in colonial history, and as I said, neo-colonial arrogance and so on. So this is exactly where your work, your ethical work, I put ethics right there in the title. I thought that was very, very important. If there is, of course, there is the aspect of ethics of research, which is do not plagiarize, please make sure your work is original and entirely your own, cite your sources and so on. That's one aspect of ethics, and a very critical one, which I'm sure you are very familiar with already and will be during your course of writing your thesis and doing your field work. The other, I think, way in which we can think about ethics in research is like this. What is my ethical responsibility towards knowledge building? We can never escape the question of power, but we can outline our own ethical responsibility. And one of them is, I think, the project of decolonizing, because it is far from ended, precisely because of the way in which neoliberalism and neocapitalism has continued the power politics of colonization. It is far from over. And if anything, because of the opportunities being offered to us because of the globalized flow of income, sometimes the power politics is of the global south, or research from global south, is often erased or blunted because of the seduction of the market, if I may put it like that, right? Because we are all, looking to be heard and seen and so on. So often the most radical work is actually coming from those who are the most invisible in the global, territory or arena in that sense. So if there is an ethics for us, it is to also foreground that radical work, right, for the global arena, acknowledging our limits and so on, and also this work of interrupting the flow of discourses and so on, assumptions. So what Lalita Gopalan says is that's how she started out her research work, by indicating or understanding that a lot of the research that has been done on visual politics and cinema, particularly from India, has been mimetic of research from the West. Yeah, it has been mimetic in the way in which it has used the same epistemologies, same paradigms, same frameworks of analysis, and naturally then reproduced the same quote unquote truths about visuality, right? So hence she uses the phrase cinema of interruption. Yes, please, am I running out of time? Yes.
Sonali, no, you're not running out of time, but yeah, can we have this discussion for next 15 minutes, and then we can open it for discussions.
Absolutely, I would love to. Yes.
Okay.
So I just quickly, highlight what I wanted to say about interruption, and then give them a few examples, students, a few examples of how genealogical research, let's say masculinity or violence or bodies, can be done, and then just conclude. Yeah. So one of the ways is to, as I said, what she says is to identify herself as a cinephile. So she says that till date, I feel that most of the research coming from the global south around cinema has not only reproduced but also rejected or repudiated the act of pleasurably engaging and indulging in cinema or visual culture. So she says, if you are not an avid, quite simply, if you're not an avid cinema watcher, then what are you doing being a cinema academic? What are you doing being a film academic, right? So she says it's very important for us to identify ourselves as cinephiles, that is, lovers of cinema in that sense, right? So there is a strong move, I think, what she does is a democratizing of the discourse of, reading films, democratizing of film studies, moving it from the upper echelons of power, where you kind of snootily in an elite position look down upon popular cultures, saying that we are avid consumers of popular culture and we must speak from that particular location, right? So cinema of interruption goes on to then talk about how much of Bollywood cinema needs its own interrogative framework to be understood. And in my thesis, at some point, maybe in the discussions section, I can talk about it. This is the work that I have done. I have tried to find tools of analysis that are, that are adequate to understanding Bollywood cinema, rather than borrowing tools of analysis from Western academia and simply using it to, whether it's genre studies or aesthetic theory, to understand, right? Because Bollywood cinema, as Rushdie points out, is far too complex, he says, for a lot of Western academia to truly understand. And I really agree with that, right? Because there are several trajectories running here. There is the trajectory of oral mythologies, there are trajectories of nukkad nataks, there are trajectories of theater that remain unexplored, there are trajectories that I look at in my own work of mythologies, mythological tropes and so on that keep recurring in our cinema, right? Where we look, if you look at the a typical Bollywood film, there's so much of disguise and reincarnation and twins and replication. So how do we understand these kinds of subjectivities and bodily practices from frameworks or epistemologies that do not practice or do not have the same histories and genealogies, right, as our own understandings of sexuality, so and bodies. So the final thing that I wanted to say is, and I will end here, is really to move towards intersectionality and even transnationalism, right? Intersectionality, very important, and interdisciplinarity. The inter of both these terms is a kind of liminality, right? So if we use that in your research paradigms, I think that you will find it to bring a lot of theory into productive crisis, and that would really help. So I just, by my concluding remarks, I would just like to highlight this, and then yes, let's move on to. So the interdisciplinarity. Now, all of what I've pointed out, you must realize, students, as all interdisciplinary, right? So whether I'm looking at Judith Butler, who is looking at gender, feminism, philosophy, Western philosophy, she is also an interdisciplinary worker. If you are looking at the work of Foucault, he's again bringing in political science, philosophy, history, literary texts, again. It is entirely interdisciplinary work. And so this is, to my mind, one of the best ways in which we can take research forward, right? Interdisciplinarity. The inter of interdisciplinarity is critical to reading texts and making new meaning, keeping the question of ethics in mind. The liminality and intersections of methodological boundaries can alert us to possible blind spots of paradigms, even as it calls attention to the impossibility of doing research in a singular monolithic area without thinking through multiple identities, boundaries, and borders, right? Transdisciplinary. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this term, but we can talk about it. I have always wondered, I know it's a very fashionable term now, or a paradigm, who has the privilege of transcending disciplines, right? Who is the subject or the privileged subject of transdisciplinary research, right? Is it possible to transcend the boundaries of disciplines, or is it a class geopolitical privilege? Does not the frisson created between the boundaries of thought, definitions, bodies, and disciplines become helpful to think of limitations and possibilities of our research? Or perhaps can trans be rethought as fluidity, non-stasis, and multiplicity? And in that sense, it can interrupt certain paradigms and create for new paradigms of thought. So those are my concluding remarks. Thank you so much for letting me blabber on forever. And yeah, I'm hoping to hear from students. Thank you very much.
Scholars, you may feel free to ask queries to Dr. Sonali. The session is open for interaction.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just lost connection. That's right.
Not a problem.
Question open.
I'm not so sure about the research scholars, but it seems that it was such a packed sort of a presentation where a lot of theoretical points of departure that they have to still allow themselves to seep in with. But it's not a question, but rather a word of thanks to bring in different interdisciplinary points of view to the students who do not here present only from the humanities background. There are also students from the other disciplines who are into the journey of their research. So I'm sure it opens a new gamut to look into for them. I'm not so sure, but many of them might have heard the names of Judith Butler and Foucault for the first time. So I think it may take a little while to be a little comfortable with this, uncomfortable boundaries that we have started to chart out.
Right.
So thank you, Sonali, for bringing all these on platform.
Thank you so much, Niyati. This is always was going to be difficult for me because doctoral students, and I'm sure scholars will, speak about it. It's very difficult to know, what backgrounds of research they have already come from. So one has to, pitch it somewhere in the void, hoping that something, resonates
Right.
with them. So thank you so much.
I know it's quite challenging, but you did it so well. And on all the other faculty members who are present here, let me just take this opportunity to convey to our students that anything that you would wish to discuss about on the matters that Sonali has addressed today, right? Feel free to approach us on campus. And if they can also get in touch with you, Sonali,
Absolutely.
students can.
Definitely. Most welcome.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yes.
Niyati ma'am. And thank you so much, Vaibhav sir. I am Urmi from this side.
Urmi ma'am, yeah, please.
So it was
Urmi
really...
ma'am is also our colleague at the Department of Languages and Literature Aesthetics. Urmi ma'am, please, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it was really, as Dr. Niyati has said, it was really a knowledge-packed session. And you have given us so many big theoretical words, but your language was very lucid. So we have got it so very lucidly. And yet, I would say that I'll have to read and I'll have to listen to the recording at least twice to understand many of the points.
I'm so sorry, but thank you.
Your language was very lucid, and it was really helpful to understand many of the concepts. If I can take some liberty here, and if I can get some permission from Vaibhav sir, I wanted to know something more about production of language that you have said, because I have also worked on sociolinguistic part. So I would like to know more about productive role of language.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so thank you so much, Dr. Urmi, for that question. I think a lot of post-structuralist thinkers, in fact, some I mentioned, but I didn't go over, like Derrida, for instance, and even to some extent, even someone more traditional like Chomsky, they do speak about language ultimately not just mediating our realities, but in a sense producing those realities. Right? So this is why I invoked Judith Butler also. She uses very traditional language theory when this is the work of Austin. And I think when Austin uses speech act theory, I don't think he is going in this socio-political philosophical direction at all. It's just a grammatical distinction between descriptive language and performative language. So some language, for instance, will say it's dark outside, right? So they make a distinction between this as being a descriptive, while it's a boy or it's a girl, or I now pronounce you man and wife.
I do.
Right. Yes. So I do, for instance, exactly. So what they say is that these kinds of terms or these kinds of phrases actually perform, they reproduce, not just reproduce, they create and constitute the very reality that they supposedly are describing. So if we can be alert to that constitutive aspect of language, and as literature scholars, I think that gamut, to use Niyati's term, that field is really large, right? Because we are seeing language producing identities, subjectivities everywhere, not just in literary texts, right? Cinematic texts and visual cultures, some of advertising, for instance. I know of an activist who has done a lovely work in simply looking at the way in which advertising about women's sexual violence often produces notions of women as being weak and vulnerable and so on. So it actually reifies and contributes to the very thing that it's supposed to stand against, right? She's an award-winning person, Ankita Anand, and she's done phenomenal work on this. And it's absolutely true. This is, and it's not just language in terms of the language written in text, but also socio-political language. Look at the rhetoric, political rhetoric. That's another area of research that produces ideas of the nation, of the state, of the citizen, even, of our very ideas of families, homes, communities. It's all produced by language, isn't it, Urmi? When I think about it, it's all. But of course, that is giving language too much power. It's not to say that, there isn't a reality, but to say that all reality is always inescapable in the way in which we think about it from language. That's all. I can't think of a way of thinking outside of language in that sense. So hence productive.
So in that case, do we look at the whole subject very subjectively or objectively?
Yeah, I would think that, any object of scrutiny is also in that sense mired in a field of subjectivity, isn't it? The object of scrutiny, I think this is also a Kantian view. The object of scrutiny changes, right? Isn't it? Weber perhaps would like to add it. It changes according to the very discourse or the very perception that is brought to see it. So it's all about how we see what we see. I think Judith Butler says that. But how do we see what we see, right?
Yeah.
We can go back to Wordsworth where he says seeing is believing.
Yeah. And Wordsworth also says that sight is one of the most tyrannical senses.
Very true.
Yeah. So, Vaibhav, I'm going to go back to Omkara. I think.
I was actually about to refer to that part. Yeah, please carry.
Yeah, this is what the song Naina, to my mind, also
Naina.
talks about, right? Naino ki manio, because so this visuality as a field that has immense power over us. And for that reason, that much more important our job to interrogate it and understand it and unpack it, rather than simply concede to its power, because it's always a course of person, right? Who determines that visuality?
I had one such example in my mind. Chhap tilak moh se chheen li.
Yes.
That is also very subjective and objective. I mean, very hardwired demarcation between subjective and objective discourse. So, thank you very much. Thank you very much for making this.
Satvik, you have a question? Satvik,
yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, as Urmi ma'am said, This talk was very informative for us as well. And I have a similar question. So Urvi ma'am was asking about the production of language. I have a question regarding the production of literature itself. So I have a question regarding the very small snippet that you brought in while you were referring to a certain occasion where a certain speaker objected or questioned the aesthetics of the literature, and he said that the literature are bad. Now, this sort of value-loaded adjective is not only restricted to Indian settings. So if I go back to Greek literature or English writings or even American writing, there are certain people who uh, critical writers who tend to crystallize literature by saying that it is not general in nature and that literature is a finer writing. So this whole debate of academic versus popular literature. And also certain other markers like universality and permanence, etc., etc. Now I understand the spirit and the model of truth that these critical writers tend to be operating on. So they are absolutist in nature. They try to peg and fixate literature with their value added concept and understanding, and anything outside of their value added description is fallacious or bad. So in this case, the literature are bad. But now I'm also aware of a transition in this very spirit. So after 1960, the literary theory underwent a whole lot of change, and I can see Sandra Harding's standpoint theory in
Satvik,
terms of feminism.
Satvik,
So
can you be brief in your question so that we can follow the track of what you want to ask?
yes, sir. So I was confused between these two transitions, and so how do I stop judging or critically evaluating Dalit literature simply because
Satvik, we lost your voice.
hello?
Yeah.
So, ma'am, see, I have sort of laid out the stream that was going in my head. I started from saying that this was the initial debate, and now after 1960, it went on. It has undergone a change. Now, with these two sort of very huge debate, I am sort of caught in, and I'm not able to make up my mind as to how should I proceed. So if I have to say, like in this case, the literature, should I not question the aesthetics of the literature simply because the postmodernist does not allow a very absolutist critical mind to.
Okay.
Sonali,
Yeah.
just a brief thing. So Satvik is our MA student.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. No, I'm very happy that you're already thinking on these lines, Satvik, and you're absolutely right. And this is exactly what I was trying to say in the first section, if the segment, where I was saying that what a literary canon is always also a question of power politics, isn't it? It's always a question of class, caste, determination, and so on. So it's obviously extremely important that we speak about Dalit literature and interrogate its aesthetics and so on, not interrogate or outline and delineate its aesthetics, because it's an aesthetic that has been othered by Brahmanical aesthetical systems, right? It's not true that when Brahmanical writing happened, and I think Ruth Vanita Salim Kidwai point this out very beautifully in their book Same Sex Love in India, for instance. So it's not always that Brahmanical literature was oppressive of Dalit literature. But this othering, I think, is a lot more of a recent phenomena. I think nationalist and post-nationalist India, where it is, of course, critical for us to see how Dalit literature and Dalit aesthetics have suffered or have been othered by a certain power-laden definition of what literature should be and should look like. right? That is exactly what one is trying to say. That is exactly what Tharu and Lalita are also talking about. Who decides what is good literature, right? If good literature has been decided for the longest time as by a patriarchal or a heteronormative category, it of course goes without question that a lot of writers, V.S. Naipaul was one of them, would look at women's writing and say the problem with women's writing, same thing as Dalit writing. Problem with women's writing is it's not good writing at all. It's very self-centered. It's always, about body politics and so on. But this is where theory comes to aid Satvik. There's a lot of theoretical exegesis that will tell you how to grapple with these charges, right? And how to make sense of these charges, how to historicize them, how to look at the politics of them. That is where genealogy comes into question. For instance, the second wave of French feminists answered this charge very well, right? Sixou said, so if phallocentric language, that is patriarchal language, has made women or constantly identify with their bodies or fixed their identities to their bodies, then women will write from their bodies. Then, that's what she says, écriture féminine is. Women's writing is writing from the body or writing the body, right? So that's one way of redefining or reopening the category of aesthetics, right? So we need to ask the scholar what, of course, he meant by bad writing. Of course, what he meant, as I said, a certain unrecognizability. There's a certain style myth. There is a certain sparseness of language. Dangle and others who have, Dalit writers who have expanded on aesthetic aspects of Dalit writing, they speak about it. A certain sparseness of language, a quickness of language, maybe shorter sentences, maybe more direct sentences. I write like that in my poetry. And I feel there is a reason I do that. And they speak about the reason with which why Dalit writers write like that. So of course we need to open that aesthetic category. And that is the only way in which a singular monolithic understanding of literary aesthetics, does not flourish. That's the idea. Multiplicity is the idea. And I think, looking at the politics of who determines these aesthetic criteria, very much that's the idea. I hope I've answered your question to some extent, Satvik.
Yeah, definitely, Sonali. One more question here is from Somanand. And Somanand is a research scholar in the Department of Language and Literature.
Hi, Somanand.
Hi, ma'am. First of all, thank you so much for the lecture. I just wanted ki chalta jaye. It should go on and on. It should not end. So
thank you so much.
So my question, I just wanted you to expand on this whole idea which we were discussing, and you also addressed that in Satvik's answer, the idea of not recognizing. Because what I find is, I'm working on comics, so what I find that this whole idea of not recognizing comics as a literature or not as a good literature or as a part of canon has been there for years and years, and even scholars' books has been written on that why this particular genre is not good enough and it's not recognizable in a way. So how do you see that power politics in this attempt of?
Yeah, this is that age-old debate between a very good question and a lovely area of research, I must say, Somanand. This is that age-old thing between what is literature and what is popular culture, what is popular and what is elite, right? Again, you will see a lot of cultural studies thinkers from Stuart Hall to Arjun Appadurai, many others actually come to mind, even Raymond Williams, early thinkers, have grappled with this question. Barthes, I'm sure you are dealing with Barthes' work. He's one of the first people to bring to the scholarly table works of popular culture, right? Objects of popular culture. Barthes, in fact, says menus, restaurant menus, billboards, children's toys, all of these things, even contents pages of magazines, all of these things are worthy of academic attention, right? Because unless we learn to interrogate and unpack, again, we are missing out on a large aspect of our experience of life, isn't it? Because so much of it is spent in popular culture, immersed in popular culture. So thankfully, Somanand, we are no longer in that arena where popular culture is not worthy of scholarly attention. It very much is. but it would just depend upon you what particular trajectories you want to take. And I think genealogy is a term you must grapple with, because that's exactly what we need to see. What are the genealogies of the comic book in India, right? Who popularized it? Some of the early comics that I can think of are extremely nationalist, right? Like Amar Chitra Katha and so on. And that genealogy remains to be done. Scholar who has done it very well is Nandini Chandra. So if you, Hannah Niyati knows of her. So if you know of her work, please look it up. She has very brilliantly, I've heard her in a talk also. She has very brilliantly unpacked and interrogated the way in which, with which Amar Chitra Katha consolidated a certain kind of majoritarian nationalism by telling us that, or Indian children, that the only kind of mythology is certain, dominant religious mythology, right? And how that had connections with the upper caste class nationalist paradigms of that time and so on. So this is important. When we think about comic book today, we are immediately transported to Western or American comic books. So once again, I will say, while that theory and that those approaches are important and you must grapple with superheroes, they also look at, by the way, how America, consolidated its nationalist politics through the use of superheroes. There's a lot of work, done in this area, and it's still happening. And I don't still understand the fascination with superheroes, but I think this is very, very critical to my work also. Why are Indian, public culture so fascinated with American superhero cinema? I watched one very, very recently before the pandemic, the one that I've watched after several years, just as an object of interest, curiosity. Actually, I went in, I forget which one it was completely, but the way in which the audience was hooting reminded me of the way in which perhaps in the 70s or 80s audiences used to hoot before the multiplexes came about, when Amitabh Bachchan would appear on the scene or something, like that. So what has happened? That's another genealogy, Somanan. What has happened to the comic book hero? How have they replaced other star bodies? Which comic books genealogies are we thinking about? How much is the global market responsible for making the comic book a popular genre today? That even design students, for instance, now are looking at comic books as a mode of communication. Younger people, in fact, are looking at it as mode of communication and so on. How did this come to be? There is a major shift. There's a major shift, or multiple shifts, I would say. So yes, you must grapple with this idea of what makes a culture popular culture and what makes it elite. I don't think there are any fixed answers, but there are answers. There are definitely answers. Yeah. I hope again I have answered.
Yes. I think, Sonali, after going through this session, I realized one session was not enough for, anyway, literature people when they study social science. Noshin is here. By the way, I take this opportunity to introduce Noshin. Noshin is a professor of economics at SLS, and she is joint coordinator with me for this research methodology and publication ethics.
Lovely.
It was really nice hearing you, Dr. Sonali, and I have personally felt this, that whenever I've heard from literature faculty, I being from a social science background, I realize how much depth is there in the way you all analyze. I guess we have never reached that depth in terms of qualitative analysis. We do try to use some qualitative I'm so sorry. Qualitative analysis as well as quantitative analysis together. But the way we think of qualitative research is way different from the depth in which you all do. So I really congratulate you for the research that you have done and the way you have shared it. For me, it was more of an introduction, because I have not heard of few terms so far. But I guess I add on to everyone's perspective that we would like to hear more from you in the coming future.
Thank you so much. I'd be happy to. I'd be most happy to.
And you might have some DU connection also, Sonali. Noshin also has a DU connection.
I guess so. I don't know if we have met earlier, but I worked in Gargi College, which was quite near to yours.
2002. So I'm 2000.
Okay, I was from 2011 to 2016.
You taught there or?
Yes, I taught there. In
2011 to 2016. Oh, I would have left by then. I was there in Kirodimal at 2006, and by 2009 I had resigned. But I've studied all through in Dayal University. So LSR, I took the Gargi exam also. I got through, and those days, thankfully, everybody had an entrance exam.
Yes.
You know, so our marks didn't matter because I came from international boarding schools. I was very scared because Indian students mostly with their 90 and 99 and 90, 99.9. I thought I wouldn't get.
True. That is so scary. Even I have felt that, but then that's how competition has grown over the years.
Yeah, but now I think all departments have wisened up. At KMC also, we used to have an entrance exam because we want to test, students' ability to analyze their critical reading skills. You know how good they are in terms of how are they reading or not. There are students who score very high marks, at least in literature. I know this, who don't read at all. So that kind of discrepancy, to kind of
Great.
Lovely.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful session, and I think you have increased our expectations now from you for the coming months. Let's see how we can accommodate you for a few more sessions wherever we get opportunity. So thank you so much, Sonali, again, and looking forward to many more in coming months.
Thank you very much. I absolutely loved it. Thank you, Vaibhav, for inviting me. I can't thank you enough again for this opportunity and for introducing me to both Niyati and Nausheen. I have, in fact, my head is brimming with ideas now. I want to turn this into some kind of paper. I'm thinking, think about. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Most enjoyed it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sonali. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you, Vaibhav. Thank you.
Okay, so
cut the call?
Yeah, you may cut the call. Okay, thank you. So we will have scholars are there, right? Today there is no halchal. I hope people are there.
Yes, sir. We are here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Fine. So now we will meet on Tuesday again with Nausheen ma'am session.
I guess we're meeting on Wednesday, right?
Oh, yes, Wednesday. Sorry. Okay, yeah, Wednesday, as usual with our own time, and with Nausheen ma'am session again. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Bye. Thank you, colleagues, for joining.
I think Harmik. No. Okay. Bye. Bye, Nausheen.
Thanks, Vaibhav. Yeah, it was really very engrossing lecture. I also enjoyed it, and it was like learning for me, more of a learning for me.
Right.
But I guess if I hear more, I'll be able to absorb.
No, I think what she did was a kind of more focused, discussion around